Open source is free as in freedom, because you have the freedom to download the source code and change it and redistribute it. Okay, so that is free as in freedom. Now, it is not entirely free without restrictions. Okay, open source does have restrictions. So there are certain things like you cannot claim a product. You cannot just say, oh, I will download the source code of the GIMP. I'll change the copyright notice, remove all the names already there, put my name on it, so that it looks like I am the one who made the GIMP possible. Okay, that is actually against the agreement in the license. So there are certain things you cannot do with open source, and they're all basically laid out in the licensing agreement itself. This is a link to the full text of GPL version 2. You do not have to read this. I'm not going to ask you questions about this license here, because as you can see, it is quite long, and it's all written in semi-legalese, which means a lawyer would find this easy to read, but for most people, it may not be as easy. Yep.
This was written 21 years ago, and they're still using this as the main.
Yes, because version 3 caused a lot of disagreement within the open source community.
Why it was created.
Yeah, Stallman is kind of an interesting person. Okay, let's just say that Stallman and Torvald, do not get along sometimes. All right, so let's move on. Which company is so dumb to make software open source? IBM.
He said IBM.
I'm not joking. For-profit companies like Sun Microsystem, and they're no longer around because they were acquired by Oracle. HP is still alive, and IBM is well and alive. They make their product, a lot of their products, open source. Okay, in other words, yep, go ahead.
What about Google? Is Android open source?
Android is open source, but Google has been very kind of sluggish when it comes to releasing the open source portion of the Android. But they're still doing it. They just have been a little bit sluggish and not as responsive as most developers would like. Yep.
Can Google say, okay, we don't want to make Android open source anymore and just make it proprietary? Can you go from one to the other, or vice versa?
It depends on the version of the license. With some licenses, you cannot. So there's GPL and then there's LGPL. LGPL stands for, it used to be L for library, and then people changed it to lesser. So lesser GPL is like GPL, except it gives you the ability to turn something that was open source into something that is not open source. Now, when you do something like, yeah, go ahead.
Are you saying lesser?
Lesser, L-E-S-S-E-R.
Lesser.
Lesser.
Is it less?
Yeah, yes, it less.
Thank you.
So in that sense, what you can do is you can take an open source product and you can say further development after this point will be closed, will be proprietary. But people can still download and make changes and branch off of whatever was the last one that was still open sourced. So it is still okay, except after a certain point you can say after this point it is no longer open source. But whatever was open sourced up to that version still has to be available for free for everybody to download. Yep.
And you'd have to create a new version for that to happen. You couldn't just be like, release 10.7 and be like 5 months in, oh, actually we want this to be proprietary.
I don't think you retroactively make something proprietary.
So you can take 10.7 and be like, this is ours now. This
Right.
is proprietary.
Right. We
You
are
don't
not
have to come out with a new one and say everything below 10.8 is open and everything above that is proprietary.
correct.
Okay.
Newer versions it will be proprietary. But people can branch it, in other words,
Cool, yeah.
people can take whatever was the last one that was still open and continue development with it. So the question now is, why would IBM, which is a very successful, profitable, for-profit company, why would that company choose to support open source? So here's the question. Here's the answer. they don't make money by licensing software. Okay, IBM, as far as I know, has very seldom make money by selling the licensing of products. Like DB2, they probably can license DB2 and say, okay, they'll charge you a certain amount of money. But IBM, for the most part, is a service company. Okay, big businesses and government will talk to IBM and look for not licensing but solutions. Okay, I'm just giving you an example here. They may or may not be using IBM products. Let's say the franchise tax board, the FTB of California, decides, you know what, our old system is too old and too slow and doesn't meet all our demands anymore, and they want something new. Now, if they choose to talk to IBM, IBM is going to sell them a solution. Okay, not a product, a solution. In other words, IBM would sit down with the franchise tax board and then figure out, okay, what are your processing requirements and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, the franchise tax board is not buying software, is not buying hardware, it's buying service. Okay, it's buying the service to keep their information system up and running, optimal, and error-free, secure, and so on. Yep.
It's kind of the same thing with Google.
Yep. Same thing with
Android.
Google.
Well, the majority of their money's not off Android. It's off of
Advertisement.
servers.
Exactly. Advertisement is a very profitable thing, and it will continue to be profitable. Now, there are companies who make money by selling licenses. Can anyone name one that I have already mentioned quite a few times today? Microsoft, very good, very good. Because you go to a store, and Adobe, okay, Adobe, Microsoft are companies who make money by selling licenses or permissions to use their software. Now, when your main business is not selling licenses of software, what are you selling? You're selling services, right? So why do you want to use open source in that case? So this paragraph here kind of explains that. Go ahead.
I was going to say that if they're trying to find solutions and people are finding solutions for them, then it's easier for them.
It's easy to test too, right? So let's say IBM came up with a great file system, okay, not NTFS that we talked about or FAT32 that we have talked about. So IBM came up with a really novel idea of a file system that is very robust, flexible, efficient, and so on and so forth. Now IBM can make this file system open source. In other words, anyone can download it and install it with your Linux distribution, and it's for free. So a lot of people like me, who are cheap, who don't want to pay a whole lot of money for performance and stuff like that, will just go ahead and say, oh, I want to try out this new file system. I just won't store anything important on it. I'll try it out. So that means, I will test it out, right? If I find a problem, even though I can download the source code and try to figure out the problem, I probably won't do it. I'll just report the problem to IBM and say, you know what, when I do something like this, the system is not responsive, or I think there's a better way to do this, it's really slow. So I'm giving feedback back to IBM. So IBM is going to basically enhance their operating system, debug the operating system, and make it even better, because of all the feedback from people who are using the open source product. So in the end, IBM is the one who benefits because they don't have a whole army of millions and millions and millions of users to test out the product. But by making the product open source, they can now utilize millions and millions of people to test it, to contribute ideas and whatnot, and they can just take in those ideas and make the product better. Okay, I just want to kind of point out that we are stopping here today. So the question now is, would that give away IBM's competitive edge so that HP can say, hey, now I can use your source code and defeat your product? So that's the question. You guys need to read about this before we meet again on Thursday.